Imagine being sold. Not figuratively. Not in the casual way people throw the phrase around when they mean they were persuaded. Actually sold. Your debt laid on a table like a price tag. Your signature obtained by someone you trusted. Your name and your body transferred to a man you had never met, in a country you had never visited, beneath a sky that looked nothing like the one you were born under. That is where this story begins. She was 23 years old. She believed in God, in hard work, in the quiet dignity of keeping your promises even when they cost you. She had never hurt anyone in her life. What happened inside a remote desert estate outside Dubai would dismantle courtrooms, generate diplomatic correspondence across 4 countries, and force an entire region to confront what happens when power decides that certain women are disposable. This is her story, and it does not end the way anyone planned. The province where Elena Soriano grew up is the kind of place that does not appear in travel guides. It sits inland, south of the capital, in a landscape of rice terraces and corrugated rooftops and roads that narrow without warning into dirt paths threading between family compounds. The mornings there smell like wood smoke and wet earth. The evenings sound like radios playing softly through open windows and the distant bark of dogs making their rounds. It is not a wealthy place. It is, however, a proud one. And that distinction matters because the people who grow up there tend to carry a very specific kind of spine, quiet, unbending, and invisible to anyone who doesn't know where to look. Elena was the second of 4 children born to Ernesto and Cynthia Soriano. Ernesto drove cargo for a regional transport cooperative, routes that took him away from home for 3 or 4 days at a stretch and returned him tired and quieter than he had left. Cynthia worked a small vegetable plot in the mornings and took in alterations and hemming in the afternoons, her sewing machine running in the corner of the front room with a rhythm the children had all fallen asleep to at one point or another. Together, they managed. The word managed here carries all the weight it deserves. It means there was food, there was school, there were shoes when shoes were necessary, and there was love in sufficient and genuine quantity. It does not mean there was anything left over. Elena had been a precise child. Not cold, her teachers remembered warmth in her, a genuine interest in the people around her, but precise in the way that children become when they observe their parents carefully and understand, without being told, that the margins are thin. She noticed things. She cataloged them quietly. She developed early the habit of thinking 3 steps ahead, not out of anxiety, but out of the particular attentiveness of someone who has decided that she will be useful, that her presence in any situation will produce something better than what existed before she arrived. She excelled in school in the way that teachers spend their careers hoping for, not the performative excellence of a student seeking approval, but the kind rooted in actual comprehension, in a mind that genuinely wanted to understand how things worked. Her biology teacher at the secondary school in town kept Elena's final examination as an example of exceptional work for years after she graduated. Her English was near flawless, self-taught beyond the classroom through a habit of reading anything she could access: newspapers, instruction manuals, the backs of packaging, borrowed novels with missing covers. When she graduated at the top of her cohort, a small collective of teachers and 1 local civic organization contributed toward her enrollment in a nursing program at Palawan Medical Institute, a mid-tier college with a solid clinical reputation and an affordable fee structure. It was not a full scholarship. Covered tuition only. Everything else, accommodation, food, materials, the bus fare back home twice a year, fell to Elena. She worked a split shift at a small clinic near campus on weekday evenings, assisting with administrative intake and basic patient monitoring. On weekends, she tutored the children of a local barangay official in mathematics and science. The money she did not spend on her own survival she sent home to Batangas, where her youngest brother, Benny, had been diagnosed at the age of 14 with a kidney condition requiring ongoing dialysis treatment at the Lakeshore Medical Center, a private facility in the provincial capital, because the government hospital's dialysis schedule had a waiting list that moved in geological time. The bills accumulated faster than anyone could manage. This is the part of the story where a certain kind of person tends to appear. His name was Arturo Velasquez. He was in his mid-50s, well-groomed by provincial standards, and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who has spent years presenting himself as someone who solves problems. He was affiliated, he explained to people who asked, with a placement organization called Meridian Global Staffing, a registered entity with glossy brochures and a professional website and an office on the third floor of a commercial building in a city an hour from Elena's hometown. He attended the same parish as Elena's maternal aunt, a fact he had likely researched before making his approach, because men like Arturo Velasquez do not approach people randomly. They identify the pressure point first. He came to the Soriano home on a Saturday afternoon when Ernesto was away on a cargo run. He brought fruit and spoke to Cynthia for 90 minutes over tea, and what he offered sounded, on the surface, like the kind of thing people pray for when they run out of other options. Elena, he explained, had been identified through the placement organization's educational partnership network, he said smoothly, as an ideal candidate for a private care position in a Gulf region residence. The household required a live-in medical support worker with nursing training. The salary was extraordinary by any local standard, structured as a 2-year contract with housing, meals, and comprehensive support provided. Enough, he calculated aloud with practiced casualness, to clear Benny's medical costs within the first 14 months. Cynthia listened. She was not naive. She had heard enough stories about overseas work to know that caution was warranted. She asked questions. Arturo had answers for all of them, smooth and detailed, and referencing documents he produced from a leather folder at precisely the right moments. What he did not mention, what was embedded in language Elena and her mother could not read, in a contractual annex written in Arabic, was the placement fee. A substantial figure that Arturo had prepositioned as a debt belonging to Elena upon arrival. Payable not to him but to her employer. Repayable through service. Non-negotiable, non-terminable by Elena unilaterally, and structured in such a way that the more time passed, the more difficult departure became. This has a formal name under international law. The name is debt bondage. The practice is illegal under no fewer than 7 international conventions and the domestic law of at least 30 countries. It is also, by the most conservative estimates available, the mechanism by which hundreds of thousands of people are held in conditions of forced labor across the world at any given moment. Elena was not present at that Saturday meeting. She was in Manila for a clinical placement. Cynthia called her that evening, and Elena listened quietly while her mother described the offer. She asked for the weekend to think. She spent the weekend in a small dormitory room near the teaching hospital, sitting with the feeling in her chest and turning it over, looking at it from every angle her methodical mind could access. She called her father. Ernesto said very little, but his voice when he spoke carried the particular weight of a man who is holding 2 things at once. His fear for his child and his understanding that he does not have the right to stop her when she is the one choosing to go. Elena flew into Dubai International on a Wednesday evening in late autumn. She was 23 years old and carrying one suitcase that held, among practical things, a framed photograph of her family taken at her nursing school's orientation, a small Bible with her name written inside the cover in her mother's handwriting, and a notebook she had been keeping since secondary school. Not a diary exactly, more a record of things she wanted to remember, observations and measurements, and the kind of factual detail that a mind like hers reflexively preserves. She cleared customs on a transit document. Her passport was collected at the arrivals gate by a woman she had not been told to expect, a composed Filipina in her late 30s named Sandra, who said she was from Meridian's Dubai partner office and that she would be handling Elena's orientation transfer. Sandra was pleasant, organized, and spoke in the comfortable cadences of a fellow countrywoman, which was almost certainly the point. She placed Elena's passport in a document folder. She did not return it. Elena was driven in a black 4-wheel drive vehicle through the city. She watched the skyline from the window, towers and light and a particular brand of impossible scale, and then out of the city. Further out. 45 minutes in a direction that put the skyline behind them and replaced it with flat, pale desert and a road that narrowed and eventually reached a gate flanked by 2 men in a private security uniform she did not recognize. Sandra said, "This is your destination. Someone will meet you inside." Then she handed Elena a typed card with an emergency contact number on it. A number Elena would later discover routed to an answering machine that had never been checked, and left. Elena stood at the gate of the estate with her suitcase and looked at what surrounded her. The walls were white and high. Beyond them, the tops of date palms swayed in a warm, dry wind. Through the main entrance, she could see the edge of a pool, its surface glowing faintly in the early evening light. It was, by any objective standard, beautiful. She picked up her suitcase. She walked inside. She did not know, in that moment, that she would not walk back out through that gate for nearly 2 years. She did not know what was in the locked room at the end of the east corridor, or whose clothes were folded in the wardrobe of the room she was about to be shown to, or what the faint groove worn into the window ledge of that room meant, and who had made it. She knew only that she had come here to save her brother's life. That was enough to keep moving forward. For now. His name was Hamdan al-Rashidi. The name itself will not appear in any international business registry, any published financial disclosure, or any publicly accessible legal record, not because he was small, but because he was precisely the kind of large that has learned to exist without leaving legible traces. His family had accumulated their wealth across 3 generations, initially through construction contracts awarded during the Gulf's first major development wave, then through private logistics arrangements that serviced the oil sector, and most recently through what his associates described in the vague and comfortable language of that world as strategic regional investment. This phrase, like most such phrases in that context, covered a range of arrangements that benefited from not being examined closely. He was 62 years old. He was tall, still carrying the frame of a man who had been physically formidable in his youth, with silver at his temples and a beard trimmed with the kind of precision that requires someone whose specific job that is. He wore traditional dress at the estate and European suits when he traveled, and he moved through both contexts with the ease of a man who has never had to adjust himself to a room because rooms have always adjusted themselves to him. He spoke Arabic, English, and a working Urdu acquired over years of managing South Asian staff, and he used each language with the calculated selectivity of someone who understands that which language you choose to speak to a person and tells them exactly how much power you believe you hold over them. He had 2 wives recognized through formal arrangements, both from established Gulf families, both housed in separate residences within a larger compound near the coast. Both of them understood, in the way that women in those circumstances develop the capacity to understand without speaking, that there was a third arrangement, a separate estate, a private category of living that existed outside the formal structure of his household. The estate itself had no name on any map. It sat approximately 43 kilometers from the city, at the end of a road that appeared on satellite imagery as an unmarked service track. The perimeter wall was 3 meters high and rendered in white limestone that caught and held the desert light in a way that made the place look, from a distance, like something between a fortress and a mirage. Inside, the landscaping had been engineered at considerable expense, date palms and desert roses and a drip irrigation system that maintained a small walled garden on the south side of the compound throughout the year. The main residence was built low and wide in the traditional Gulf style, with high ceilings and arched corridors that kept the interior cool regardless of the temperature outside. The infinity pool ran along the western edge of the terrace, positioned so that at sunset the water appeared to merge with the desert horizon in a seamless line of gold and blue. The estate's domestic operations were managed by a woman named Manal, who had held the position for 11 years and who ran the household with the exact precision of someone who has been taught, over time, that questions have costs. Manal was Jordanian, in her late 40s, efficient and composed and entirely without the kind of warmth that might accidentally become complicity. She met Elena at the entrance of the main residence on the evening of her arrival and walked her through the house with the practiced neutral tone of someone giving a tour that has been given before. The room Elena was assigned was on the 2nd floor, east-facing. It was larger than any room she had ever slept in. The bed was European, the linens Egyptian cotton, the attached bathroom tiled in a pale stone that held the coolness of the building in a way that felt, after the warmth of the travel, genuinely soothing. There was a wardrobe of dark wood that stood against the far wall. Inside it, when Elena opened it that first evening, were clothes modest, well-fitting, arranged by category. Women's clothes, in a size close to her own. Elena stood at the open wardrobe for a moment longer than the situation required. Then she closed it and sat on the edge of the bed. Manal had told her. Meals were served at structured times in the dining room adjacent to the kitchen, on the ground floor. She was not to approach the east corridor beyond the 2nd door, which was a storage area for household administration. She was not to use the staff entrance or engage with the external security team. Her employer would receive her in the main sitting room the following morning at 9 o'clock. Elena noted all of this, She also noted the door to her room, specifically the external hardware, a sliding bolt on the outside of the frame, currently unengaged but present and functional. She noted the window, which opened 6 inches before a secondary latch prevented it going further. She noted the sight line from her window to the main gate, which was partially obscured by the palms but visible enough to observe the guard rotation. She did not sleep well, but she slept with the deliberate intention of being rested, because she had already decided that clarity was going to be her only real resource. Hamdan al-Rashidi appeared in the sitting room the following morning at 9:15. He was unhurried in the way of men whose time is the default measurement of everyone else's. He looked at Elena with a long, appraising stillness that she met with the neutral, attentive expression she had used for years with difficult patience, present, professional, giving nothing away. Through Manal, who served as interpreter where necessary, he communicated several things in a sequence that he appeared to consider courteous. She would be his third wife in the traditional sense he preferred. This was not, he explained, a legal arrangement by Western or Philippine definitions, but it was, by his understanding of his own cultural authority, entirely valid. She would want for nothing. She would be clothed, fed, and cared for. She would have access to a physician when needed. She would, in short, be provided for, and in return she would be available to him. He did not ask. Elena said, "I understand." She said it in a tone that could be read as acceptance. It was not acceptance. It was the first line of a script she was already, in a very early and unformed way, beginning to write. The weeks that followed established the architecture of her captivity with a thoroughness that was, in its own way, almost admirable. There was no overt cruelty in the day-to-day mechanics. Hamdan was not a man who shouted or threatened. He didn't need to. The absence of her passport, the remoteness of the estate, the fact that she had no telephone and no access to any communication channel not routed through Manal's oversight, these things accomplished what threats accomplish without the noise. She was given a small media tablet, restricted, stripped of any cellular functionality, its wireless access filtered through the estate's internal network. She was given books. She was given the freedom to walk in the walled garden between certain hours. She was given, in every practical sense, the life of a very comfortable prisoner. She began her education, not formally, not in any way that was visible. Elena had spent her nursing training learning to observe, to read a patient's chart, yes, but also to read a patient, to pick up the information that wasn't written down. Who was deteriorating faster than the numbers suggested. Who was in more pain than they were expressing. Whose family's body language in the visitor's chair told a different story than their words. She applied that same capacity to the estate, the staff, and to Hamdan himself. She learned Manal's schedule within the first 2 weeks. She learned which members of the external staff interacted with Manal directly and which operated independently. She learned that a woman named Precious, a Ugandan domestic worker responsible for the second-floor rooms, followed a cleaning rotation that took her through the East Corridor on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and that on those mornings the secondary door at the end of the corridor was sometimes left ajar, though never for long. She learned that Hamdan's physician, a man named Dr. Samir Khalil, who visited the estate once every 3 weeks for what Manal described as routine household health checks, drove a white saloon and arrived always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon and spent between 20 and 50 minutes before departing. She learned this from the sound of his car on the approach road, audible from her window, and from the duration of sounds below. She learned, 6 weeks in, that Dr. Khalil's visits did not always include her, but that they sometimes did. His manner during those visits was pleasant, efficient, and carefully non-committal, the manner of a physician who has organized himself into a role that does not require him to think too hard about the broader context of what he is doing. He took her blood pressure, her temperature, asked standard questions about sleep and appetite and general well-being in English that was correct but minimal, wrote notes she could not see, and left. She catalogued everything. She noticed, in her 3rd month, that the clothes in the wardrobe had been replaced, quietly, during a morning she had been in the garden, with items in a slightly different size. Still modest, still appropriate, but different. As if someone had reassessed and adjusted. She thought about this for several days. She thought about the original clothes, who they had belonged to, why they had been there when she arrived and where they had gone. She thought about what it meant that someone had prepared this room and this wardrobe and this specific selection of products in the bathroom, as if they had been expecting someone with her approximate dimensions. She thought about the external bolt on her door. She thought about the photographs she had seen in Hamden's sitting room. Framed images of the estate at different times of year, always the same views, the terrace, the garden, the pool, and how none of them contained people. Not a single one. As if the estate had been, always and only, a stage that people passed through without leaving a mark. She thought about a single small thing she had found on her third day. A thin silver chain, no pendant, tucked into the corner gap between the window ledge and the wall, the kind of place that a thorough cleaning would miss. It was broken, snapped, not unclasped. She had held it in her palm in the afternoon light for a long time, turning it over. Someone had been in this room before her. Someone who had reached for the window with enough repetition to wear a groove into the ledge. Someone who was no longer here. Elena closed her fingers around the chain. She put it in the inside pocket of the notebook she had brought from home, the one her mother had packed with her, the one with observations and measurements and factual detail going back to her secondary school years. She added a new entry, not emotional, not fearful, methodical. She listed what she knew. She listed what she suspected. She listed what she still needed to find out. Then she closed the notebook and placed it at the bottom of her suitcase, beneath the photograph of her family and the Bible with her name in her mother's handwriting. She had not yet found the locked room, but she had begun, with the quiet and absolute certainty of someone who has run out of reasons not to look for it. She had been looking for a way out. What she found was a graveyard. There is a particular kind of knowledge that arrives not as a single revelation but as an accumulation, a slow, patient gathering of small things that individually mean little and collectively mean everything. Elena had been accumulating for 4 months by the time she found the room. For months of Tuesday mornings and careful observation and a notebook filling gradually with the kind of detail that only a mind trained to notice clinical deviation would think to record. The estate had its rhythms, as all closed systems do. Manal arrived in the kitchen at 6:15 every morning and spent the first hour reviewing the day's logistics with a precision that Elena had come to recognize as the behavior of someone who uses order as a form of self-protection. The external security team rotated at 6, 12, 6, and midnight. The gardening staff, 2 men from Kerala who arrived in a white utility vehicle on Monday and Thursday mornings, worked the south garden and the approach road without entering the main residence. Dr. Samir Khalil, whose white saloon Elena could identify by the particular pitch of its engine on the approach road, came on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month, reliably, between the hours of 2 and 4 in the afternoon. Precious, the Ugandan housekeeper responsible for the 2nd floor, cleaned Elena's corridor on Tuesday and Friday mornings, beginning at 8:30. On Fridays, her route took her through the east corridor, past the door Manal had identified as storage, and back. On Tuesdays, her route was identical, but on Tuesdays she moved more slowly through the east corridor, pausing at the storage door in a way that appeared, if you were watching from the right angle, as though she were listening for something rather than cleaning around it. Elena had observed this for 6 consecutive Tuesdays before she allowed herself to draw any conclusion from it, because conclusions drawn from insufficient data are the most dangerous kind. On the 7th Tuesday, Precious paused at the storage door, looked at the corridor in both directions with the casual sweep of someone checking for hazards rather than observers, and left the door standing 3 inches open as she moved to the far end of the corridor to retrieve a cleaning trolley. Elena was in her room. Her door was ajar by exactly the width she had learned, through patient experimentation, allowed her to observe the corridor without the observation being detectable from the corridor itself. She waited 4 minutes. She heard Precious's trolley reach the far end of the corridor and stop. She heard the sound of a cupboard being opened, supplies being moved. She moved. The corridor was cool and dim, the morning light not yet reaching this side of the building. The storage door was heavier than it looked. Solid core, the kind of door that exists not to keep things tidy but to keep things private. Inside, the light came from a single ceiling fixture that she found by running her hand up the wall to the left, a reflex from years of entering darkened hospital rooms without disturbing patients. What the light revealed was not what Manal had described. It was not a storage room in any meaningful sense. There was a single metal shelving unit against the right wall holding household documentation, insurance folders, maintenance contracts, utility records, the kind of administrative material that accumulates in any large property. These were clearly visible, clearly real, and clearly positioned at eye level as the first thing you would see if you opened the door and looked straight ahead. But Elena had been a nursing student long enough to know that what is placed at eye level in a room is not always what the room is for. She looked lower, behind the shelving unit's lowest shelf, pushed toward the wall in a way that the shelving itself partially concealed if you were standing, was a second set of folders, older, their spines without labels, their covers a uniform manila that had yellowed slightly at the edges. 7 of them. Then, in a separate stack beside them, 2 more. 9 total. She pulled the first one. Inside were photographs, printed rather than digital, the kind of photographs produced by a private printing service rather than a consumer device, with the slightly oversaturated quality of professional photo paper. The photographs showed a young woman. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, Southeast Asian, photographed in what was recognizably the estate's sitting room, the same arched window visible behind her. She was not posed for the photograph. She appeared to be unaware it was being taken, captured mid-conversation, looking slightly to the left of the lens. Below the photographs were documents. The first was a contract written in Arabic, which Elena read partially. Her 4 months in the estate had given her a functional reading knowledge of certain repeated phrases and legal formulations, and partially understood through context. It referenced a placement arrangement and a debt figure. Below the contract were health records. These were in English, printed on the letterhead of a clinic Elena did not recognize. The name on the letterhead read Crescent Medical Consulting, Private, Dubai. The records followed a progression that Elena, standing in the dim light of the storage room with the folder open in her hands, recognized with the cold precision of someone who had spent clinical hours watching the same progression in patients. An initial screening, comprehensive, with all results within normal ranges. A follow-up 6 weeks later, still normal. A third appointment for months in, where a single line in the lab results section had been circled in blue ink by someone. Reviewing the record, a circle drawn with the deliberate care of someone marking something they want to remember. Below the circled result, a handwritten notation in Arabic. Elena read it 3 times to be certain she had it right. Removal arranged. Coordinator notified. She stood very still. Then she opened the second folder. The same structure. A different woman, this one appeared African, Ethiopian perhaps, similar age. The same sitting room photograph. The same contract format. The same Crescent Medical Consulting letterhead. A different timeline but the same progression. The same circled result. The same notation. Removal arranged. Coordinator notified. She opened all 9 folders. Each one was a woman. Different nationalities, Filipino, Indonesian, Nepali, Ethiopian, Kenyan, Sri Lankan. Different arrival years, spanning what the dates suggested was nearly a decade. Each one with the same sitting room photograph, the same debt contract, the same medical record progression, and the same blue-circled notation at the point where the records ended. Removal arranged. Coordinator notified. Not one of the 9 folders contained any documentation of what removal had actually meant. No repatriation records. No forwarding health records to a receiving physician. No return flight documentation. Just the notation and then nothing. A file that simply stopped, as though the woman it documented had ceased to require documentation because she had ceased to be a person the file needed to track. Elena closed the 9th folder and placed it back precisely as she had found it, at the same angle, the same depth behind the shelving unit's lower edge. She replaced each folder in sequence. She turned off the light. She pulled the door to the same 3-inch gap it had been when she entered and walked back to her room at a pace that was measured, unhurried, and gave nothing away to any camera or casual observer who might have been watching. She sat on the edge of her bed. She did not cry. She would have said later that this was not toughness or the absence of feeling. It was the particular response of a clinical mind that has received a diagnosis it was already, at some level, prepared for. The body sometimes knows before it is told. She had known something was wrong with this place from the day she arrived. She had known from the groove in the window ledge and the broken chain and the clothes already in the wardrobe in her approximate size. She had known from the way Precious paused at the door on Tuesday mornings and from the expression on Dr. Khalil's face when he wrote notes she wasn't permitted to read. She had known. What the folders had given her was not knowledge. It was specificity. And specificity changes everything, because a vague fear is paralyzing while a precise and documented threat becomes, for someone with the right kind of mind, a problem to be solved. She pulled her notebook from the bottom of her suitcase. She opened it past all the previous entries, the estate schedule, the staff patterns, Manal's routine, the guard rotation, and turned to a clean page near the back. She wrote 2 things. The first was a numbered list of what she had observed in the 9 folders. The dates, the nationalities, the document formats, the clinic name, the notation. She wrote it in the compact, abbreviated shorthand she had developed in nursing school for clinical observation. Detail-dense, legible only to herself. The second was a single line at the bottom of the page, separated from the list by a space that on the page looked like ordinary white space, but in her mind was the distance between what she now knew and what she had not yet been able to confirm about herself. Because Elena, who had trained in clinical settings and who had spent years understanding what symptoms mean before they are formally named, had been experiencing something for the past 3 weeks that she had been working very hard to explain away. A fatigue that sleep did not touch. A persistent low temperature that the estate's warmth did not account for. A weight loss she could track by the fit of clothes that had been sized to her on arrival and were no longer quite fitting the same way. She had told herself it was the stress of captivity, the inadequate diet, the psychological weight of isolation. She had told herself this with the particular determination of someone who knows they are not entirely convincing themselves. She looked at the single line she had written at the bottom of the page. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she requested a medical appointment through Manal the following morning, citing what she described, in the vague and navigable language she had learned was most likely to be accommodated without interrogation, as a persistent female complaint requiring attention. Dr. Khalil arrived that Friday. He conducted his examination with his usual brisk efficiency in the small examination room adjacent to the ground floor bathroom that the estate maintained for his visits. He took blood. He said he would have results at the following appointment. His expression when Elena described her symptoms was controlled in the way of a face that has been trained to receive certain information without reacting to it visibly. He returned 11 days later. Not on a scheduled visit, a special trip which told Elena something before he opened his mouth. He told her in the same minimal, careful English he always used, seated on the opposite side of a small table, his hands folded, not meeting her eyes. The results were consistent with a particular condition. He named it using the clinical terminology, with no elaboration or compassion. He prescribed a medication that Elena recognized, from her training as a second-tier option. Not the standard protocol that any informed physician would begin with, but a cheaper, older, less effective compound. He told her to rest. He wrote a notation in his records folder. He did not offer her a copy. He left. Elena sat in the examination room for 11 minutes after she heard his car engine start and diminish down the approach road. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs and the light coming through the frosted glass of the small high window and thought, with the terrible clarity that arrives when the last version of a story you were telling yourself about your own situation is no longer available to you, about the 9 folders in the East Corridor storage room. She thought about the blue circle. She thought about the notation. Removal arranged. Coordinator notified. She was 23 years old. She was sick. She was in a locked estate 43 kilometers from a city, without her passport, without a phone, without a single person in the building she could trust with what she now knew. She was, by any structural measure, completely without options. She returned to her room. She opened her notebook to the clean page near the back, below the list and below the single line she had written. She wrote a third thing. Not a list this time. Not an observation. Plan. There is a version of this story, the version that requires Elena to be a passive subject of circumstances rather than their architect, where what happened next was improvised. Reactive. The desperate response of a woman with no options and no time. That version is wrong. What Elena built over the following 6 weeks was not improvisation. It was engineering. The patient, structural, load-bearing kind, designed by a mind that had spent years learning how systems work and how they fail, and had now applied that knowledge to the only problem that mattered. She worked quietly, in the margins of days that looked from the outside exactly as they had always looked. Breakfast, the garden, the tablet, the restricted hours, the meals, the careful performances of compliance that she had been delivering since her first week and had no intention of abandoning now, when it was more important than ever that the surface remain undisturbed. The plan had 3 components, and she built them in order, because sequencing matters in engineering as much as design. The first component was the audience. Elena had understood from the beginning that escape, conventional physical escape, the kind that involves running, was not viable. The passport problem alone closed that avenue definitively. A Filipino woman in the UAE without documentation and without a credible employer of record was, by the architecture of the legal system she was operating within, invisible in precisely the wrong way. She would be detained, returned, and quietly managed before she could access anyone with the authority to hear her. Hamden's network of local relationships, which he had pieced together over months of careful listening during his occasional business calls conducted in rooms adjacent to the corridor, was sufficient to ensure that outcome efficiently. What she needed was not escape. What she needed was witnesses of a specific and irreducible kind, people whose presence made silence impossible, not because they were particularly noble, but because they operated in jurisdictions where their own names and their own organizations would be implicated if they chose afterward to pretend they had seen nothing. She learned about the quarterly business dinners through Manal. It happened across 3 separate conversations, each one Elena had initiated under the guise of expressing a desire to be useful to the household. A motivation she had introduced gradually, framed as the response of a woman learning to accept her situation and seeking purpose within it. Manal was organized and efficient and, Elena had concluded, entirely without cruelty. She was a woman who had arranged herself around a structure rather than examine the structure itself, and people like that tend to respond warmly to someone who appears to be doing the same. The conversations about the dinners were, for Manal, simply conversations about logistics. For Elena, they were intelligence. Hamden hosted between 10 and 15 guests at the estate 4 times a year. The events were held here specifically because the isolation and the grandeur communicated something that a restaurant or a hotel function room could not, that he was a man of sufficient standing that the world traveled to him rather than the reverse. The guest list was typically a combination of regional associates, representatives of affiliated trading interests, and international partners. The international partners rotated across the year, but the upcoming dinner, 7 weeks away when Elena first identified it, was one at which Manal confirmed, in a conversation about catering requirements, that at least 4 international guests were expected. 2 were directors of a European investment firm with a London registration that Elena had located in a financial press archive available through the tablet's filtered browser. 2 were regional representatives of an international trade monitoring organization whose public mandate, she found in its own organizational literature, included oversight of labor standards in Gulf region business operations. She read that last part 3 times. Then she began building her audience around them. The second component was the documentation. Elena's tablet had a camera. She had confirmed this in her second week at the estate, discovering that the camera application had not been restricted along with the cellular and communication functions, an oversight that was either genuine negligence or the product of an assumption that a camera without transmission capability was harmless. The assumption was wrong. A camera without transmission capability is still a camera, and a camera produces records, and records, when placed into the right hands at the right moment, are the closest thing to armor that a person in Elena's position can manufacture. She returned to the East Corridor storage room over 5 consecutive Tuesdays, each time during the window that Precious's routine opened, each time moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had planned every second and could not afford to waste a single one. She photographed every document in every folder. She worked folder by folder, page by page, in the available light, checking each image for clarity before moving to the next. She photographed the contract formats, the medical record progressions, the clinic letterheads, and every instance of the blue-circled notation and the Arabic that accompanied it. She stored the images inside the tablet's photo library, organized within an album she had labeled, in Tagalog as estate reference, household interiors, embedded among photographs she had genuinely taken of the garden and the sitting room and the view from her window, the kind of innocuous visual record that someone creating a personal memory archive might accumulate. It was the photographic equivalent of hiding something in plain sight, and it depended on no one examining it closely enough to notice that among images of desert roses and tiled corridors were methodically photographed document pages from a locked room that no one was supposed to have accessed. She also memorized. She read each document until she could recall it without reference: names, dates, document structure, the clinic letterhead, the notation. She did this because she understood that physical devices can be taken. Memory cannot, as long as the person holding it remains standing and able to speak. The third component was the mechanism. This was the most technically demanding part of the plan, and it was the part Elena returned to most carefully in her notebook, working through calculations and reconsidering variables in the way of someone who understands that an error here is not recoverable. She needed Hamden incapacitated on the night of the dinner. Not dead. She had considered this with the dispassionate clarity she had applied to everything else and concluded that a dead host before the guests had heard what she needed them to hear would produce chaos of the wrong kind, investigations focused in the wrong direction, and her own credibility. There is a version of this story, the version that requires Elena to be a passive subject of circumstances rather than their architect, where what happened next was improvised. Reactive. The desperate response of a woman with no options and no time. That version is wrong. What Elena built over the following 6 weeks was not improvisation. It was engineering, the patient, structural, load-bearing kind, designed by a mind that had spent years learning how systems work and how they fail, and had now applied that knowledge to the only problem that mattered. She worked quietly, in the margins of days that looked from the outside exactly as they had always looked. Breakfast, the garden, the tablet, the restricted hours, the meals, the careful performances of compliance that she had been delivering since her first week and had no intention of abandoning now, when it was more important than ever that the surface remain undisturbed. The plan had 3 components, and she built them in order, because sequencing matters in engineering as much as design. The first component was the audience. Elena had understood from the beginning that escape, conventional physical escape, the kind that involves running, was not viable. The passport problem alone closed that avenue definitively. A Filipino woman in the UAE without documentation and without a credible employer of record was, by the architecture of the legal system she was operating within, invisible in precisely the wrong way. She would be detained, returned, and quietly managed before she could access anyone with the authority to hear her. Hamden's network of local relationships, which she had pieced together over months of careful listening during his occasional business calls conducted in rooms adjacent to the corridor, was sufficient to ensure that outcome efficiently. What she needed was not escape. What she needed was witnesses of a specific and irreducible kind, people whose presence made silence impossible, not because they were particularly noble, but because they operated in jurisdictions where their own names and their own organizations would be implicated if they chose afterward to pretend they had seen nothing. She learned about the quarterly business dinners through Manal. It happened across 3 separate conversations, each one Elena had initiated under the guise of expressing a desire to be useful to the household. A motivation she had introduced gradually, framed as the response of a woman learning to accept her situation and seeking purpose within it. Manal was organized and efficient and, Elena had concluded, entirely without cruelty. She was a woman who had arranged herself around a structure rather than examine the structure itself. And people like that tend to respond warmly to someone who appears to be doing the same. The conversations about the dinners were, for Manal, simply conversations about logistics. For Elena, they were intelligence. Hamden hosted between 10 and 15 guests at the estate 4 times a year. The events were held here specifically because the isolation and the grandeur communicated something that a restaurant or a hotel function room could not, that he was a man of sufficient standing that the world traveled to him rather than the reverse. The guest list was typically a combination of regional associates, representatives of affiliated trading interests, and international partners. The international partners rotated across the year, but the upcoming dinner, 7 weeks away when Elena first identified it, was one at which Manal confirmed, in a conversation about catering requirements, that at least 4 international guests were expected. 2 were directors of a European investment firm with a London registration that Elena had located in a financial press archive available through the tablet's filtered browser. 2 were regional representatives of an international trade monitoring organization whose public mandate, she found in its own organizational literature, included oversight of labor standards in Gulf region business operations. She read that last part 3 times. Then she began building her audience around them. The second component was the documentation. Elena's tablet had a camera. She had confirmed this in her second week at the estate, discovering that the camera application had not been restricted along with the cellular and communication functions. An oversight that was either genuine negligence or the product of an assumption that a camera without transmission capability was harmless. The assumption was wrong. A camera without transmission capability is still a camera, and a camera produces records, and records, when placed into the right hands at the right moment, are the closest thing to armor that a person in Elena's position can manufacture. She returned to the East Corridor storage room over 5 consecutive Tuesdays, each time during the window that Precious's routine opened, each time moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had planned every second and could not afford to waste a single one. She photographed every document in every folder. She worked folder by folder, page by page, in the available light, checking each image for clarity before moving to the next. She photographed the contract formats, the medical record progressions, the clinic letterheads, and every instance of the blue-circled notation and the Arabic that accompanied it. She stored the images inside the tablet's photo library, organized within an album she had labeled, in Tagalog as estate reference, household interiors, embedded among photographs she had genuinely taken of the garden and the sitting room and the view from her window, the kind of innocuous visual record that someone creating a personal memory archive might accumulate. It was the photographic equivalent of hiding something in plain sight, and it depended on no one examining it closely enough to notice that among images of desert roses and tiled corridors were methodically photographed document pages from a locked room that no one was supposed to have accessed. She also memorized. She read each document until she could recall it without reference: names, dates, document structure, the clinic letterhead, the notation. She did this because she understood that physical devices can be taken. Memory cannot, as long as the person holding it remains standing and able to speak. The third component was the mechanism. This was the most technically demanding part of the plan, and it was the part Elena returned to most carefully in her notebook, working through calculations and reconsidering variables in the way of someone who understands that an error here is not recoverable. She needed Hamden incapacitated on the night of the dinner, not dead. She had considered this with the dispassionate clarity she had applied to everything else and concluded that a dead host before the guests had heard what she needed them to hear would produce chaos of the wrong kind, investigations focused in the wrong direction, and her own credibility. She had known it from the moment she opened the 9th folder and understood, with the specific and irreversible clarity of a woman who has read the ending of her own story in someone else's file, that she was not going to be the 10th. She was going to make sure that there was never a 10th. Whatever that required. The morning of the dinner arrived the way all mornings at the estate arrived, with the sound of the garden irrigation system clicking on at 5:45 and the faint smell of coffee beginning in the kitchen below, and the light coming through Elena's window in the particular pale gold that the desert produces in the hour before the sun fully commits to the day. It was, on the surface, indistinguishable from any other morning. Elena was already awake. She had not slept beyond 2 in the morning, not because of fear. She had examined that possibility carefully and found that what she was feeling was not fear in the conventional sense but something closer to the concentrated alertness that precedes any high-stakes clinical event. The feeling of standing outside an operating theater with all your preparation behind you and nothing left to do but perform it. She had felt this before, during nursing practical examinations, during emergency admissions during her clinical rotations. She recognized it and used it the way she always had, as fuel rather than interference. She dressed in the clothes she had been assigned for the occasion. Manal had selected them the previous day, a modest but elegant ensemble appropriate for an evening in which the estate was receiving guests. Elena had worn them without comment, noting their color and cut with the specific awareness of someone who already knew she would be changing before the evening reached its critical point. She had, at the bottom of her suitcase beneath the photograph and the Bible and the notebook, the clothes she had arrived in. The white blouse, the dark trousers, her own. She had not worn them since the night she landed at Dubai International and was transferred into the estate's custody. She had kept them folded, undisturbed, for the entirety of her time here, for a reason she had not fully articulated to herself until she wrote it in the notebook 3 weeks ago. When I speak tonight, I will be wearing what I chose, not what was given to me. Manal moved through the morning with her characteristic precision, managing the arrival of the catering staff. For additional people brought in from a service company the estate had used for years, unfamiliar with Elena and carrying none of the particular blindness that the resident staff had developed, and overseeing the setup of the formal dining room with the focused authority of someone who takes deep personal satisfaction in a table set correctly. The centerpieces were arrangements of pale desert flowers. The linen was pressed. The lighting had been adjusted to the warm, amber register that made the estate's interiors look, as they were designed to look, like a painting of wealth rather than its lived reality. Elena moved through her assigned tasks, coordinating the placement of serving arrangements, managing a detail of the table setting Manal had delegated to her, moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the quiet, useful efficiency she had performed for months. She was visible and unremarkable, which was exactly what she required. The catering staff acknowledged her briefly and returned their attention to their own work. The resident staff were occupied. Manal was in the entrance hall reviewing the final guest confirmation. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Elena was alone in the kitchen for 7 minutes. She had timed this window across 3 days of observation. The kitchen cleared between 4:45 and 5:15 as catering staff took a break before the evening service began. Manal was in the front of the house. Precious had finished the second floor and would not return downstairs until 5:30. The kitchen entrance faced a corridor with no camera coverage, a detail Elena had confirmed by tracking the slight delay in the estate's interior lighting adjustment system, which was linked to the security network and responded to motion sensors in surveilled areas. The kitchen did not trigger it. She moved to the dry goods storage. The herbal supplement preparation was where it always was. She had prepared the concentrated steeping solution that morning in her room, using a method she had refined across 2 weeks of careful calibration. A small, sealed container she had constructed from materials available in the bathroom, which she carried now in the inner pocket of the jacket she was wearing. She introduced the solution into Hamden's individual tea preparation, a personal blend Manal kept separate from the general household supply, in a dedicated canister with his preferred mixture. In the precise quantity her calculations had established for his body weight, working quickly, gloved with teeth, she returned the canister to its position. She put the empty container in the pocket. She walked out of the kitchen and into the corridor and continued toward the dining room to check the placement settings she had been assigned to verify. Her hands were steady. She noted this clinically as information. The guests arrived between 7 and 7:45. 12 of the expected 14. 2 of Hamden's regional associates had sent apologies through their offices that afternoon, which Manal had mentioned without concern. Elena registered this adjustment and recalculated mentally. 12 witnesses instead of 14. Still sufficient. The 4 international guests she had identified were among the 12. She confirmed this by positioning herself near the entrance hall under the pretext of directing catering staff, observing each arrival as they were received by Hamden and guided inside. The 2 European investment directors were exactly as their professional photographs had suggested. Men in their late 50s, well-tailored and composed, carrying the particular confidence of people who travel frequently enough that even this level of impressive surroundings does not visibly affect them. The 2 representatives of the Trade Monitoring Organization were younger, a man and a woman, both wearing the identifying lanyards of their organization, a habit Elena had observed from photographs of their public events, that they maintained even in non-conference settings, which told her something useful about how they understood their own role in any room they entered. Thin cotton of a cleaning cloth folded around her fingers. She studied their faces. She committed them to memory. She confirmed what she had needed to confirm. Then she went upstairs to change. The white blouse was exactly as she had left it, folded with the precision of something preserved. She put it on. She put on the dark trousers. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Not with vanity, but with the same checking gaze she had used before clinical examinations, the verification that everything required was in place. She went back downstairs. The pre-dinner tea service was managed by Manal personally, as always. She moved through the sitting room where the guests had assembled for pre-dinner conversation with the practiced ease of someone who has performed this ritual many times. Hamden's personal preparation was on the tray alongside the general service. Elena, passing through the sitting room in her service role, observed Manal deliver it. She observed Hamden receive it without ceremony, setting it on the low table beside his chair as he continued a conversation with one of his regional associates in Arabic that moved too quickly for her to follow fully. She returned to the service corridor and waited. She counted minutes. At 7 minutes past 8, the dining room was called to table. Elena watched through the service corridor sightline as the guests moved from the sitting room to the dining room. Hamden moved with them, upright, fluid, the natural center of gravitational pull in any room he occupied. He took his seat at the head of the table with the settled ease of a man entirely at home in his own authority. Elena counted another 14 minutes. Dinner service began. The catering staff moved. The conversation around the table rose in the warm, slightly amplified way of people who are comfortable and well-fed and in the presence of someone whose status gives the evening its own social weight. Hamden spoke. Led, as he always led, in the direction of his own preferred subjects. His voice carrying the practiced warmth of a host who understands that performance is as important as content. Elena watched the timing. At 11 minutes into the first course, she saw it. The slight recalibration of his posture, barely visible, the kind of micro-adjustment that most people in the room would read as a man shifting in his chair. His head dipped forward a fraction of a second too slowly when he laughed at something the European director to his left had said. His hand, reaching for his water glass, corrected mid-motion. It was subtle enough that the guests continued their conversations without pause. Elena had been waiting for exactly this. She stepped out of the service corridor. She walked into the dining room. She walked to the center of the room and she stopped and she stood completely still, and she said, in English that was clear and that carried across the room without being raised, "My name is Elena Soriano. I am from the Philippines. I was brought to this estate through a debt bondage arrangement, and I have been held here without my passport or my freedom for 8 months. I am speaking to you now because you are the only people in this building in front of whom I cannot be made to disappear." The room stopped. Not the slow, gradual quiet of a conversation tapering. The immediate, complete cessation of a room in which every person has simultaneously registered that something is happening that they did not account for. Hamden's head came up. His eyes found her across the table with a focus that the sedative had narrowed but not eliminated. She had calibrated for disorientation, not incapacitation, and what remained of his operational consciousness was contracting now around the single stimulus of her presence in his dining room in clothes he had never seen her wear, speaking in a voice he had never heard her use. He said her name, just her name, in a voice that was slower and lower than his guests had heard from him all evening, and that registered, to the people closest to him, as something wrong, though none of them had yet identified what. Elena did not stop. She had practiced this for 17 days. She spoke for 9 minutes. She identified herself completely, full name, Philippine National Identification Number, province of origin, the name of the placement organization that had recruited her and the agent who had processed her. She described the debt bondage structure in precise legal language, referencing the international conventions it violated by their formal designations, because she had spent weeks ensuring she knew the names. She described the East Corridor storage room and its contents. She named the 9 folders and described their structure. She stated the name on the medical letterhead, Crescent Medical Consulting, and described the progression documented in each file and the notation that ended each one, and she translated the notation into English in a voice that did not waver. Removal arranged. Coordinator notified. She stated her own medical status directly and without euphemism. She stated what the records established about how she had been infected and why the medication she had been prescribed was not the standard protocol, and what that choice of medication communicated about the prescribing physician's intentions regarding her prognosis and her continued presence at the estate. She held up the tablet, which she had set before entering the dining room to display the photographs she had taken across 5 Tuesday mornings in the East Corridor storage room. The estate's presentation screen on the dining room's far wall, a system she had accessed during setup that afternoon, received the tablet's display signal and the photographs appeared, large and legible, behind the head of the table where Hamden al-Rashidi sat struggling to rise from his chair. 9 folders, photographed page by page, visible to 12 people who had not expected to see them. The female representative from the Trade Monitoring Organization was on her feet before Elena finished speaking. The 2 European directors were already reaching for their phones with the reflexive speed of people who understand immediately that they are in the presence of something that has legal and professional implications for their own names and their own organizations. The regional associates nearest to Hamden were focused on him. His struggle to rise, the visible impairment of his coordination, The contrast between the man who had welcomed them this evening and the man now gripping the table edge with both hands and producing words in Arabic that came out in the wrong sequence. One of his regional associates, a man Elena had observed at a previous visit to the estate, a longtime associate whose instinct in any crisis was the protection of the association, moved toward her from the far side of the room with the deliberate, controlled urgency of someone who has decided that physical removal is the most efficient solution. He did not reach her. The male trade organization representative stepped into the space between them with the blunt physical authority of someone who has decided, in real time, that his organizational mandate has just activated in the most direct possible way. He did not touch the associate. He simply occupied the space and looked at him with the particular steadiness of a man who knows that what happens in the next 60 seconds will be documented and reviewed. The associate stopped. Hamden was standing. He had managed it through the force of a fury that was overriding the sedative's effect with the particular stubbornness of a large, physically powerful man whose entire life experience has reinforced the belief that his will supersedes circumstance. His coordination was compromised. His movements had the slightly delayed, overcorrecting quality that Elena had calculated and accounted for, but he was vertical, and he was moving around the table toward her with an expression that had shed every layer of the evening's social performance and arrived at something beneath it that was very old and very simple. Elena moved, not in panic, in the direction she had chosen. She had known from the beginning of the plan's construction that physical contact was likely. She had known that a man like Hamden, cornered and exposed in front of his business associates, with the sedative reducing his calculation but not his instinct, would move toward her rather than away. She had chosen the terrace as the terminus of that movement for reasons that were architectural and intentional. The terrace was visible through the floor-length glass panels of the dining room's exterior wall, fully observable from the table, fully lit by the pool's ambient lighting. Whatever happened on the terrace happened in front of witnesses who were already watching. She moved through the terrace doors and he came after her because he was always going to, because the alternative, remaining in the dining room with 12 witnesses and a presentation screen full of documents, was not something his instinct permitted him to calculate as an option. The terrace was warm and still, the infinity pool running its full length along the western edge, its surface blue-lit from below, the desert dark and absolute beyond the low boundary wall where the water appeared to extend into nothing. Elena moved toward the pool's edge, not away from it, because she had studied the geometry of this space for months and she knew where the light was and where the witnesses' sightlines reached and where the ground was level and where it wasn't. He reached her at the pool's boundary. His hand closed around her upper arm with the grip of a man who has spent 62 years being certain that his physical authority is the final word in any disagreement. He pulled her toward him. He said something in Arabic she did not need to translate because the intention was in his hands and his eyes and the angle of his body. Elena had not trained in self-defense. She had not needed to. She had trained in anatomy and human biomechanics and the physics of how bodies move and how leverage operates between a larger and a smaller person when the smaller person has spent months studying the larger person's gait, his posture, the particular way he had begun to favor his left knee in recent weeks, the way the sedative had narrowed his proprioception so that his balance, always his body's advantage, had become its liability. She did not fight him. She turned into his grip rather than against it, which redirected his pull's momentum rather than absorbing it, and she stepped to the side at the exact angle that placed his center of gravity over the pool's low boundary edge, and she withdrew from his grip with the sharp, compact motion she had visualized hundreds of times in the nights before this evening. His mass did the rest. He went over the edge in a diagonal that was terrible to hear and more terrible to see, and the pool received him with a sound that ended the shouting inside the dining room and replaced it with a silence that lasted 1 full second before everyone moved at once. Security personnel reached the terrace in under 2 minutes. They pulled Hamden from the pool. He was breathing. He was alive, his chest heaving, his eyes open and moving, the sedative and the impact producing a state of profound confusion from which he could not generate coherent speech. Elena stood at the pool's edge and did not run. She had never planned to run. She put her hands where they could be seen, and she waited. The police arrived at the estate gate at 9:17 in the evening. 2 vehicles initially, then 3 more within the following 20 minutes as the nature of the incident was relayed back to the central dispatch through a channel that Elena would later learn had been activated not by the estate's security team, who had contacted their private organizational command structure first, operating on the assumption that this was a household matter to be managed internally, but by the female representative of the trade monitoring organization, who had walked to the far corner of the dining room within 30 seconds of Hamden going over the pool's edge, placed an international call on her personal phone to her organization's emergency legal contact number, and described in calm, sequential detail everything she had witnessed, beginning with Elena's statement and ending with the pool and the documents still displayed on the dining room's presentation screen behind her. That call, placed before the police were contacted, before the estate's private security had finished retrieving Hamden from the water, before anyone in the building had fully processed what the last 14 minutes had contained, was the single action that most significantly altered the trajectory of everything that followed. It created a record, time-stamped, received by an organization with international standing and its own legal obligations, that could not be retroactively adjusted or quietly resolved. Whatever came next, something had been witnessed by the right people and reported to the right organization before anyone had the opportunity to decide that silence was the more convenient outcome. Elena was detained on the terrace by the first responding officers. She offered no resistance and said nothing during the initial detention beyond stating her name and her nationality twice, clearly, for anyone writing anything down. She had understood from the beginning of the plan's construction that detention was not a failure. It was a component. She was in custody, which meant she was in a system, and systems, even imperfect ones, operate on documentation and testimony were the only weapons she had ever had. Hamden was transported to the Crescent Oasis Private Hospital, a facility Elena recognized by name, because its name had appeared in the bottom margin of several of the medical documents she had photographed in the East Corridor storage room, the invoicing correspondence between the estate and Dr. Samir Khalil's clinic. He was alive, assessed with blunt cranial trauma and aspiration complications from the pool, and admitted to intensive care. His condition for the first 48 hours was described in the medical record that would eventually become part of the investigative file as critical but survivable. He did not survive. On the morning of the third day following the dinner, Hamden al-Rashidi died in the intensive care unit of the Crescent Oasis Private Hospital. The cause of death documented in his clinical record was cranial trauma, compounded by aspiration pneumonia and cardiovascular complications arising from the prolonged period of physical stress. His blood toxicology, drawn upon admission in accordance with standard emergency procedure, identified the sedative compound at a concentration that was documented and preserved in the file. Every element of that documentation would later become foundational to the criminal proceedings. The investigation that opened in the week following Elena's detention was, by the account of every legal professional who subsequently engaged with it, unlike anything the jurisdiction's investigative apparatus had processed in recent years, not because the individual elements were without precedent but because their combination, and the quality and volume of the documentation supporting them, created a case that moved in every direction simultaneously. There was a criminal investigation. There was a labor trafficking investigation. There was a diplomatic process. There was an international organizational inquiry. And threading through all of them, like a spine around which everything else organized itself, was the documentation that Elena had spent 5 Tuesday mornings photographing in a locked room and had preserved on a restricted tablet that she had passed, in 3 seconds of deliberate motion, to the male European investment director during the moment of physical intervention in the dining room. He had transmitted its contents to 4 recipients before midnight on the night of the dinner. The 9 folders from the East Corridor storage room were collected by investigators the morning after the incident. Their contents were consistent, precisely and verifiably consistent, with the photographs already in the hands of 3 legal organizations and a journalist at an international wire service whose contact details Elena had memorized from a byline on an investigative piece she had found in the tablet's restricted news access 7 weeks prior. The journalist published the first account 4 days after the incident. It was careful, legally reviewed, and specific in the way that only journalism supported by actual documentation can be. It named Hamden al-Rashidi. It named Arturo Velasquez. It named Crescent Medical Consulting and Dr. Samir Khalil. It reproduced, with legal authorization, portions of the documentation recovered from the estate. It named the 9 women in the folders by the names recorded in their files, something Elena had specifically requested through her legal representative, because the women in those folders had been systematically unmade into administrative problems, and having their names in print in a document that would be archived and searchable was the smallest possible restoration of what had been taken from them. Of the 9 women, investigators working in coordination with Philippine, Indonesian, Ethiopian, Kenyan, Nepali, and Sri Lankan authorities spent the subsequent 2 years attempting to establish outcomes. 4 were located alive in their countries of origin. None of them had received any medical follow-up corresponding to the conditions documented in their Crescent medical consulting records. All 4 required significant medical intervention upon identification. 2 were confirmed deceased through cause of death records obtained through foreign government cooperation. Their families had been told different things: illness, accident, voluntary return to a different country, and none of them had known until investigators contacted them the year following the incident that any formal record of what had happened to their family member existed anywhere. 3 women were never conclusively located. The number 3. Elena had been told it in a formal briefing by the lead investigator, a measured woman named Rania who had handled the case with a consistent and unsentimental professionalism that Elena had come to deeply respect. 3 women whose folders existed in a locked room but whose persons had been removed from the world so completely that 2 years of international investigative cooperation had not been enough to find them. Elena had kept the silver chain from behind the window ledge. She had carried it through the detention and the legal proceedings in the small personal effects bag she was permitted to retain. When she was told about the 3 women who could not be found, she took the chain from the bag and held it in her palm. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said to Rania, "Someone wore this. She was in that room before me. I need to know if she is in those 3. The chain was submitted to forensic analysis. The DNA extracted from the metal was cross-referenced against samples provided by families of the 3 unlocated women. The process took 4 months. The result provided a match. It did not locate the woman, but it confirmed her name and her family, and gave investigators a specificity to their search that they had not previously had. Her family, in a small city in Indonesia, was notified. They received the information with the complicated grief of people who had already mourned for 3 years but had mourned without certainty, and for whom confirmation, even without a body, even without an ending, was a form of recognition that their daughter and sister and cousin had existed and had not simply evaporated. Dr. Samir Khalil was detained within 72 hours of the investigative files being formally opened. He retained legal counsel and initially declined to cooperate. His cooperation began in the 2nd week of his detention, progressing incrementally as the volume and specificity of the documentation against him became clear to him through his legal representative's review of the case file. He cooperated fully within 3 weeks. His testimony established the clinical protocol he had maintained under Hamdan's direction across 9 years, the screening process, the progression monitoring, the moment at which he would report an adverse finding to Hamdan through a private communication channel, and what followed from that report. His testimony used the same phrase that appeared in the files, the phrase Elena had read 9 times by torchlight in a storage room and translated with the cold precision of someone reading her own future. Removal arranged. He was unable, in testimony, to account for the outcome of every woman following removal notification. He stated that his involvement ended at the point of notification. He stated this in the tone of a man who has decided to believe that ending involvement at a particular moment constitutes ending responsibility at that same moment. The court did not agree. He was sentenced to 18 years following a conviction on charges that included criminal negligence resulting in death, conspiracy in labor trafficking, and medical malpractice causing grievous harm. He served his sentence at a facility that bore no resemblance to anything his professional life had previously contained. Arturo Velasquez was arrested by Philippine authorities 19 days after the initial reporting on the case, based on documentation recovered from Hamdan's administrative records that established the financial transaction structure of the placement arrangement and Velasquez's specific role in processing Elena's transfer. The arrest was made by officers from the National Investigative Bureau at the commercial office building where Meridian Global Staffing maintained its 3rd-floor premises. The office was found to contain documentation relating to 17 additional placement transactions over a 6-year period, each following a structure consistent with Elena's case. The investigation that followed resulted in charges against Velasquez and 3 associates, and the referral of several additional cases to international law enforcement partners. Velasquez was ultimately convicted on 11 counts under anti-trafficking legislation and sentenced to 24 years. Elena's own legal proceedings occupied 21 months. Her defense was built by a UAE-based attorney who had engaged within 48 hours of the incident, later joined by an international human rights legal team that took the case without fee once the documentation of Elena's circumstances became public through the initial investigative reporting. The defense argument was built around three axes: the documented evidence of systematic threat to her life constituting ongoing self-defense justification, the absence of any direct violent action on her part. Hamdan's fall had been caused by the combination of his own aggressive physical approach and a compromised balance that was the product of his own motion, redirected, and the question of whether the sedative administration, conducted by a person with medical training in response to a documented threat to her life, could be characterized under the same legal framework as an unprovoked attack. The prosecution argued premeditation. They presented the sedative preparation as evidence of a planned assault. The defense presented the 9 folders. The 9 folders and their documented progression, the medical records, the circled result, the notation, and the testimony of Dr. Khalil establishing what that notation had meant in practice across 9 years, provided the self-defense argument with a specificity that was difficult to argue against in good faith. Elena had not planned an attack. She had planned the only survival response available to a woman who had read the documentation of her own predetermined ending in a locked room and had no legal mechanism, no authority, and no conventional avenue through which to prevent it. The verdict was not clean. It was contested and appealed and returned to and contested again, in the way that verdicts in genuinely complex cases always are, by the nature of legal systems that were not designed with situations like Elena's in mind. She was acquitted of all charges related to Hamdan's death. She was convicted on a reduced charge of unauthorized administration of a substance, which carried a sentence that the court, in its reasoning, aligned with the time she had already served in pretrial detention. She was released on a Tuesday morning, 21 months after the night of the dinner. She wore the white blouse and the dark trousers. Her mother had flown in 3 days earlier, funded through a charitable diaspora organization that had followed the case from its first public reporting. Cynthia Soriano stood outside the detention facility with a woman from the organization beside her and a photograph. The same photograph Elena had kept at the bottom of her suitcase throughout everything, the family at the nursing school orientation. Laminated now, which Elena recognized but her mother did not explain, simply held out when Elena came through the doors. Elena took it. She looked at it for a moment. She put it in her pocket. They did not speak for the first few minutes. They walked together in the direction of the car the organization had arranged, and Cynthia held her daughter's hand with both of hers, and Elena let her, and the silence between them was not absence. It was the presence of everything that would eventually be said when language was capable of bearing the weight. Benny was alive. His dialysis had been maintained throughout the legal proceedings through the same charitable fund. He was 21 years old, watching the proceedings in the same fragments of real-time coverage available on a phone screen from a medical center chair in the provincial capital, and he had a scar on his wrist from a dialysis line that he had stopped noticing because the sight of it had become as familiar as breathing. He was alive because his sister had gone somewhere impossible and survived it, and he understood that at a depth that does not resolve into anything speakable, only into the quality of how he lived afterward. Elena returned to the Philippines. She did not return to the institute where she had begun her nursing degree, not immediately. She needed the kind of time that does not appear in any schedule, the time that the body demands after it has been used beyond what it consented to and is reclaiming, incrementally and on its own terms, the right to simply exist without purpose or performance. She returned to nursing school 3 years later. A different institution, the Mabuhay College of Health Sciences in Manila, a larger program with a research focus that suited where her mind had traveled over the intervening years. She graduated on a Friday morning. She sat in the 3rd row. Her mother was in the front, turned around in her seat watching Elena walk across the stage with an expression that was too large and too specific to be described as simply proud. Her father sat beside Cynthia. Ernesto Soriano had aged, in Elena's perception, significantly across the years of the legal proceedings. Not in a simple physical way but in the particular aging of a man who has spent a sustained period reckoning with the gap between what he intended and what his actions produced. He had given statements in the trafficking investigation. He had been honest in those statements, about the contract and about the signing and about the Saturday afternoon meeting with Arturo Velasquez and the fruit and the tea and the careful, practiced voice describing an opportunity. His honesty had not absolved him of anything. It had not been intended to. It had been the only accurate accounting he was capable of making, and he was making it, and the making of it was ongoing. Elena looked at him from the stage. He looked back. She did not look away. Precious, the Ugandan housekeeper from the estate, had been granted protected witness status during the investigation and had cooperated with investigators in a deposition that confirmed the deliberate access she had provided to the East Corridor storage room across 7 consecutive Tuesday mornings. She had never been asked directly by investigators why she had done it. In an interview given afterward to a journalist covering the case's aftermath, she was asked. She said, "I watched them come and go, woman after woman, each one thinking she was the first. I could not open the room for them. I could not reach the authorities without losing everything. But I could leave a door 3 inches open on Tuesday mornings. That was the size of what I had to give. She was the one who knew what to do with it." The case generated policy responses across multiple jurisdictions in the years following its resolution. Labor protection regulations in the UAE were amended in ways that advocacy organizations described as meaningful but incomplete. The language of official reform and the language of advocates rarely converge exactly, because they are measuring against different baselines. The Philippine government tightened oversight requirements for Gulf region placement organizations, resulting in the identification and closure of dozens of entities operating with debt bondage structures similar to the one that had processed Elena's transfer. These changes did not undo what had been done. They were not sufficient. They were also not nothing, and Elena, in the single extended public interview she gave 2 years after her graduation, said something about this that was widely quoted afterward and that had the quality of someone who has thought about a thing for a long time and arrived at a position rather than a slogan. She said, "I am not a symbol of a problem being solved. I am evidence that the problem existed. I was 23 years old and I was alone in a locked room and I built what I built from what I had. Other women are in those rooms right now with less than I had and more to lose. That is what needs to be in the conversation, not what I survived. What they are surviving tonight while we are talking." She said it in the same clear, precise English she had used at the dinner. The same voice, not raised, not performed. The journalist asked her at the end of the interview how she thought about the chain. The silver chain from behind the window ledge. Whether she still had it. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said she did. She said she kept it in the notebook, the one from home, the one her mother had packed, the one with the observations and the measurements going back to secondary school. She said it was still on the page where she had first written the plan, near the back of the notebook, beneath the numbered list and the single line she had written the night Dr. Khalil left without meeting her eyes. The journalist asked what the single line said. Elena looked at the table between them for a moment. "Not the 10th, she said. Then she picked up her bag and thanked the journalist and walked out through the door.